My son and his wife treated me like a fragile burden, tricking me into signing away control of my entire life while I was living in their home. They called it care, but it was a prison. They took my phone, cut me off from the world, and I even overheard them call me social suicide. They were so sure they had won. But they had no idea I was a former Wall Street strategist with a multi-million-dollar secret. And they were about to find out just how satisfying my quiet revenge would be. It all began in a room so perfectly designed, it felt like no one actually lived there. My son Ethan and his wife Lily were hosting one of their pre-charity gala cocktail parties. Their Westchester home was a testament to Lily's ambition, a symphony in muted grays and whites with art on the walls that was chosen for its investment potential, not its soul. I sat on a low, uncomfortable sofa, a glass of water in my hand, and simply observed. Decades on Wall Street had taught me that you learn more by watching the players than by listening to their speeches. Lily was a marvel of controlled anxiety. She floated through the room, her smile as bright and brittle as a Christmas ornament. But her eyes gave her away. They darted everywhere, checking for smudges on wine glasses for guests who weren't mingling for the single wilting petal on a white orchid she must have rearranged a dozen times. She was performing the role of the perfect hostess in the perfect home, and the strain was immense. When she brought a prominent doctor and his wife over to meet me, her performance reached its peak. She placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look affectionate, but felt like an anchor. She introduced me not by name, but by my function. "This is Ethan's mother. We're so happy to be looking after her." The words hung in the air, painting me as a fragile heirloom, a responsibility they had graciously shouldered. I saw the look in the other couple's eyes, a polite, pitying sympathy. In that moment, I wasn't Martha Ellison, a woman who had once managed multi-million-dollar portfolios. I was a dependent, a prop in Lily's perfectly curated life. In the weeks that followed, Lily's care became a suffocating fog. It started small. She began collecting my mail from the postbox, insisting she was just trying to help me sort the junk from the important letters. Then my phone calls started going through her first. She claimed she was screening for telemarketers to protect me from scams, but old friends started mentioning how difficult it was to get a hold of me. The net was tightening slowly and methodically. The final move was the most insidious. One afternoon, she announced she was disconnecting the Wi-Fi in my part of the house. It was for my health, she explained, with a deeply concerned expression. She had read an article about the dangers of harmful radiation for people my age. I knew it was nonsense, but I also knew what it really was, a digital amputation. She was cutting me off from the world, from the news, from the financial portals, where I had spent a lifetime building my independence. I was being isolated, all under the guise of protection. Then came the day of the betrayal. Lily came into my room with a cheerful smile and a thin leather folio. She said Ethan's new estate planner had sent over some routine documents, just a few updates for their files. She sat beside me, flipping through the pages, her manicured finger pointing to the signature lines. "It's all just boring insurance stuff," she said, her voice light and breezy. Tucked in the middle of the stack, I saw it a durable power of attorney, a document that would give them complete control. She dismissed it instantly. "Oh, that's just a formality," she said, "in case of an emergency, so we can pay your bills for you if you ever need us to." I didn't look at her. I looked at my son Ethan, who was standing in the doorway, his posture stooped, his eyes fixed on a spot on the floor. I waited for him to speak, to defend me, to say, "Mom, let's read this properly." I searched his face for a flicker of the boy I had raised, the one who knew right from wrong. But he said nothing. He just gave a weak, mumbled agreement, his silence a deafening roar of complicity. That was the blow that truly landed the passive betrayal from my own son. Trusting the memory of that little boy, not the man standing before me, I picked up the pen and signed my life away. That night, sleep wouldn't come. The house was silent, a tomb of good taste. I got up for a glass of water, and as I passed the study, I saw a sliver of light from under the door. I heard Lily's voice, but it wasn't her usual calm, measured tone. It was a sharp, frantic whisper laced with a panic I had never heard before. I stopped my hand on the wall and I listened. "I don't care what it takes, he can't bring her to the fundraiser," she hissed into the phone. There was a pause. "The Livingstons will be there. She's just not the right look." Another pause, and then the words that cracked my world open. "It's social suicide." That's what I was. Not a mother, not a woman, not a person. I was a liability, a blemish on their perfect picture. And in that cold, quiet hallway, I finally understood that this wasn't about care or protection. It was about erasure. By the way, if you're enjoying the story so far, please consider subscribing so you don't miss what's next. We'd also love to hear your own story if you'd like to share it with our community. Now let's get back to it. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay in the dark, the word social suicide echoing in the silence. The shock was a physical thing, a cold weight in my chest. But as the hours passed, the shock began to recede, and something else took its place, a chilling, crystalline clarity. The kind I used to feel before a major market move when all the noise fell away and the path forward became ruthlessly simple. The grieving for the son I thought I had was over. The strategist was awake. The next morning, I went down for breakfast. The scene was as always perfect. Freshly squeezed orange juice in tall glasses, croissants on a porcelain plate, and a suffocating silence. Ethan was hiding behind his newspaper, and Lily was scrolling through her phone, a tiny, forced smile on her face. They were acting as if nothing had happened, as if I were still the oblivious old woman they were so kindly looking after. I let the silence stretch for a moment before I made my first move. I looked directly at my son, my voice calm and pleasant. I asked him if he remembered the name of that private equity firm his father and I had invested in back in the 90s, the one that specialized in tech startups. It was a surgical question, aimed at a history Lily couldn't possibly know, and a responsibility Ethan had never bothered to learn. It was a test of his loyalty, and I already knew he would fail. You could see the panic flicker in his eyes. He lowered his paper, his mouth opening and closing silently. He fumbled, searching for an answer that wasn't there, the shame coloring his neck. Before he could form a single word, Lily jumped in her voice, a little too loud, a little too confident. She said something about a little retirement fund and how Ethan had handled all of that for me. It was a confident, commanding, and completely incorrect guess. The lie hung in the air between us. My son wouldn't meet my gaze. In that moment, the crack in their united front became a chasm. He knew she was lying, and she knew he was weak, and I knew they were amateurs. That afternoon, I played my next card. I told them I had a routine doctor's appointment in the city. Ethan drove the silence in the car thick with unspoken words. As we neared the medical building, I asked him to drop me off at the corner so I could get a coffee first. He agreed, probably relieved to be rid of me for a few minutes. The second his car turned the corner, I walked in the opposite direction, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm. I found what I was looking for, an old graffiti-covered payphone. I picked up the receiver, the cold plastic, a strange comfort, and dialed a number I knew by heart. He answered on the second ring. David was one of the sharpest corporate lawyers in New York, and an old, trusted colleague from my past life. I kept my voice even professional. I told him my name, and then I gave him the instruction we had agreed upon decades ago, a contingency for a future I hoped would never come. I told him it was time to activate the Phoenix Protocol. When Ethan picked me up an hour later, I was carrying a coffee and wearing a placid smile. But Lily must have sensed something was wrong. Perhaps it was the way Ethan couldn't look at her, or maybe my performance of frailty was a little less convincing. That evening she came to my room. Her face was a mask of deep, manufactured concern. She told me my doctor had called her directly a blatant lie and was very concerned about my cognitive state. He had recommended complete rest. With that, she took my old flip phone from my bedside table and my laptop from my desk. It was for my own good, she said, so I wouldn't get stressed or confused. She was so gentle, so caring as she stripped away my last connections to the outside world. The door clicked shut behind her, and I stood in the silence of my luxurious prison. I finally understood. I wasn't just being dismissed or neglected anymore. This was a deliberate, systematic campaign to erase me completely. My world shrank to the four walls of my bedroom. After Lily took my phone and laptop, a strange sort of quiet descended. To her, it must have looked like I had finally broken. And I let her believe it. I leaned into the role she had cast for me, the confused, frail matriarch. I started asking her to repeat things. I'd let my hand tremble just a little when I reached for a glass of water. I allowed her to cut my food, to read my mail to me, to manage every tiny detail of my life. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do, swallowing my pride and playing the part of a ghost in my own life. But from her perspective, it was working perfectly. I could see the relief wash over her. The tension in her shoulders eased. I even heard her on the phone with Ethan one evening, her voice bright and triumphant, telling him that his mother had finally accepted her new reality. They thought their battle was won. In reality, my war was just beginning. One afternoon, I was walking past the living room and I saw her. Lily was curled up on that perfect white sofa, but her posture was anything but perfect. She was hunched over her phone, her thumbs scrolling frantically. Her face, usually a mask of composed ambition, was tight, with something raw and ugly. Pure envy. I was a strategist, trained to read people, and I could see the story plain as day. She wasn't just looking at pictures. She was absorbing the success of others like a poison, comparing every inch of her life to the curated perfection on her screen. I could almost picture her past a girl from a background she was ashamed of, standing at the edge of a world she was desperate to conquer, terrified that someone would see the cracks in her facade. It wasn't an excuse for her cruelty, not at all, but it was a motive. And understanding your enemy's motive is the first rule of engagement. My opportunity came on a Tuesday. Lily had a 2-hour Pilates class, a sacred ritual she never missed. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I went to work. Tucked away in the back of my closet inside the lining of an old suitcase was my emergency kit, a small, outdated tablet fully charged. It was slow ancient by today's standards, but it was a lifeline. I sat on my bed, my heart pounding, and turned it on. The hardest part was the Wi-Fi. Lily had locked down her own network, but I knew my next-door neighbor, a kind but forgetful man, had an unsecured guest network. The signal was weak, just one flickering bar, but it was enough. My fingers flew across the screen, muscle memory from a lifetime of navigating complex systems. I logged into my encrypted financial portal, bypassing the two-factor authentication by routing it through a secure email only David had access to. The Phoenix Protocol was in motion. I sent David the encrypted authorization to execute the sale of my Westchester home, effective immediately. Then I accessed my portfolio, the real one, not the little retirement fund Lily had invented. With a series of swift, decisive clicks, I liquidated nearly 80% of it, a sum that would have made Lily's head spin. The funds were transferred to a new account, a ghost account under a corporate name that didn't exist on any public record. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. I shut down the tablet, returned it to its hiding place, and sat down in my armchair, breathing evenly, just as Lily's car pulled back into the driveway. She grew arrogant in the days that followed, drunk on her perceived victory. And that's when she made her critical mistake. I was in my room, resting my eyes, pretending to nap. She was on the phone just outside my door, her voice a casual, confident hum. She was talking to a real estate agent. I heard my address. I heard her laugh as she talked about getting the property appraised and exploring our options now that Mom is more settled. She was planning to sell my home, the home I had built with my husband, the home my son grew up in. She assumed I was asleep, a non-entity, a piece of furniture that no longer had a say in her world. But I was wide awake and I heard everything. For a week, I waited. Patience is a weapon the arrogant always underestimate. I played my part, the docile, fading woman in the guest room, while Lily buzzed with a new, confident energy. She had her plan. She was going to appraise my house, sell my life, and solidify her position in a world that terrified her. She thought she was in the final stages of a careful campaign. She had no idea she was a pawn in a game that had already been won. The doorbell rang on a Thursday afternoon. Lily was arranging flowers, humming to herself. Ethan was in the study, likely trying to ignore the gnawing emptiness of his own choices. I was in the living room, sitting in my usual armchair, but for the first time in months, I was not just observing. I was waiting for my cue. Lily opened the door, her hostess smile ready, and it faltered. Standing on her pristine porch was David. He was exactly as I remembered, impeccable in a dark gray suit, carrying a slim leather briefcase with an air of authority so potent it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the hallway. He was a shark, my shark, and he was miles from his natural habitat of a Manhattan boardroom. Lily tried to block his path, stammering about appointments and asking who he was. David simply looked past her, his eyes finding mine. He walked into the living room as if he owned it, his presence a jarring note in the symphony of muted colors. He stopped before me and gave a small, respectful bow of his head. He didn't acknowledge Lily or the fact that Ethan was now standing pale and confused in the study doorway. David's focus was entirely on me. He opened his briefcase and handed me a thin folder. His voice was calm, professional, and loud enough for everyone to hear. He told me the closing was complete and the funds had been transferred just as I had instructed. Those two words, closing and funds, detonated in the silent room. I watched the color drain from Lily's face. It was a fascinating thing to witness the precise moment a person's entire reality collapses. Her mind was scrambling, trying to make sense of an equation where she was no longer in control. All her careful planning, her whispered phone calls, her condescending acts of care, it was all a pathetic sideshow, and she finally knew it. Her voice was a choked whisper, asking what he was talking about, insisting that the house was... But she couldn't finish. The carefully constructed dam of her composure burst. It wasn't remorse that poured out. It was a raw, ugly torrent of shame. The real her, the terrified girl she had spent her entire adult life trying to bury, was screaming. She wasn't sorry for betraying me. She was furious that I had outsmarted her. She railed about how she had done everything to build a perfect life, a respected family. And then came the confession that laid her soul bare. She looked at me, her face twisted with a resentment so pure it was almost beautiful in its honesty. She said I had made them look poor. Poor. That was the word that finally woke my son. Ethan looked at his wife as if seeing her for the first time. The desperate insecurity, the cruel ambition, the profound pettiness of it all, it was finally visible to him. He looked at her, then at me, and I saw the full crushing weight of his own complicity land on him. The word came out of his mouth as a horrified gasp. Poor my mother. Poor. He finally understood what he had sacrificed me for: a shallow, fragile illusion of status. I watched the foundation of their marriage crumble into dust, right there on the expensive white rug. That was my cue. I placed the folder neatly on the side table and stood up. The feigned weakness of the last few weeks vanished. I straightened my back, and I felt my own power return to me, a quiet, formidable force. The frailty was gone. The victim was gone. Only the strategist remained. Lily and Ethan were staring at me, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. But I wasn't looking at them anymore. They had become irrelevant. My gaze was fixed on David. I told him my car was waiting. Then I walked towards the door. I didn't rush. Every step was deliberate. I didn't look back at my son's horrified face or my daughter-in-law's tear-streaked ruin. I simply walked away, leaving them standing there, two statues in the wreckage of their perfect, hollow life, finally terrified of the consequences they could no longer control. The car ride with David was silent. There was nothing left to say. He dropped me at a private airfield where a small jet was waiting. The Phoenix Protocol wasn't just about financial liquidation, it was a complete extraction. As the jet climbed into the sky, I watched the lights of New York shrink and disappear, and I didn't feel sadness or anger. I felt nothing at all. It was the beautiful, terrifying, absolute freedom of a blank page. 6 months later, that blank page was filled with the scent of cinnamon and baking bread. My new life was in a small, charming town in Vermont, nestled between green mountains. I had bought a historic building on Main Street and poured my energy and a fraction of my capital into a bakery I called Second Rise. It was a place of warmth and community, everything my son's house was not. I worked behind the counter, my hands dusted with flour, and I was happier than I had been in 30 years. I had a new family, a chosen one made up of my staff, my regular customers, and the townspeople who had welcomed me without question. He found me on a crisp autumn Saturday. The bakery was bustling the bell over the door, jingling a constant, cheerful rhythm. I was laughing with my young head baker, a talented woman named Sarah, when the bell jingled again. I looked up, and the laughter died in my throat. It was Ethan. He looked older, thinner, and the polished confidence he used to wear like a second skin was gone, replaced by a desperate, haunted look. For a moment, the whole bakery seemed to hold its breath. But I am a strategist. I do not react. I act. I gave Sarah a reassuring nod and walked to the counter, wiping it down with a cloth. He approached slowly, like a man approaching a ghost. His voice was choked, and he started to apologize, the words tumbling out in a broken rush. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a scene. I didn't yell or cry or demand an explanation. I simply looked at him with polite inquiry, as I would any customer, and asked him what he would like. He faltered, confused by my professional distance. He ordered a black coffee. I poured it for him, my hands steady, and rang it up on the register. I took his money and gave him his change. The entire transaction was devastatingly normal. As he stood there, lost his eyes, darted around the bakery. He saw the photos on the wall of our staff picnic of me with the mayor at the town fair. He saw the easy smiles and camaraderie I shared with my team. He saw the life I had built from the wreckage he had left behind, a peaceful, thriving, joyful existence. It was the ultimate, irrefutable proof of how completely he and his wife had failed me. He took his coffee to a small table in the corner and sat there watching. The judgment, when it came, wasn't from me. It came from inside himself. I saw it happen. I was showing Sarah a new kneading technique, my hands moving with purpose, and she was listening with a look of rapt attention and deep respect. Ethan watched us, and I saw his face crumple. It was a silent, agonizing collapse. In that moment, he finally understood. He hadn't just neglected his mother. He had discarded a brilliant, capable, powerful woman he had never bothered to know. The condemnation wasn't my anger. It was the crushing weight of his own regret, a loss so profound it was only now revealing its true size. After a long time, he got up and came back to the counter. The bakery had quieted down. He pleaded, his voice raw, asking for a second chance, for any chance at all. I stopped what I was doing, wiped my hands on my apron, and gave him my full attention. I looked into the eyes of the man my son had become, and I felt a distant, tragic pity. My voice was soft, but the words were made of steel. I told him I accepted his apology, but I also told him that I didn't have a place for him in this life. I had worked too hard for this peace. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The quiet, unbreakable boundary was the final, devastating consequence. He stood there for another moment, the truth of it landing, and then he turned and walked out of my bakery, the little bell over the door jingling his final permanent exit. After he left, a profound silence settled over the bakery, a quiet that even the lunchtime chatter couldn't penetrate. I watched the door swing shut behind him, and I didn't feel a surge of victory or the satisfaction of revenge. I just felt the quiet click of a final page being turned. The story of that part of my life was over. I took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of yeast and sugar, and I went back to work. I didn't seek out news of them, but eventually news found me. David, my lawyer, sent a single brief email a few months later, formally closing his file on my extraction. He included a short, discreet update, knowing I would want the variables accounted for. He wrote that the drive back to New York was likely a long one for Ethan. When he arrived home, he didn't find a supportive partner, but a co-conspirator in a failed coup. Their carefully curated social circle, having heard whispers of the dramatic fallout, had subtly but decisively closed ranks. Invitations dried up. Calls went unreturned. Their gilded cage, once a symbol of their success, had become a true prison, haunted by the ghost of their own cruelty. Over the next year, their paths diverged, a detail I learned from an old acquaintance who had moved to Vermont and was now one of my regulars. She told me Lily remained stubbornly unrepentant. She blamed me, she blamed Ethan, she blamed the unfairness of the world, anyone but herself. She was a woman desperately trying to maintain a facade that had already crumbled, her social events becoming smaller and more brittle, her smiles more strained. She was trapped in the past, forever trying to rewrite a history that had already been published. Ethan, however, had taken a different path. The shock of that day in my bakery had apparently shattered him completely, but it was a necessary breaking. I heard he had started therapy, finally confronting the weakness and conflict avoidance that had defined his life. It was a slow, painful process of accountability, of trying to understand how he could have stood by and allowed his own mother to be erased. There was no redemption in it for us. No path back to me, but I hoped for his sake that there was a path forward for him toward becoming a man of substance rather than a man of appearances. As for me, I was too busy building to look back. My second rise was more than a bakery. It was a mission. With David's help, I used the immense wealth I had commanded for decades to create a foundation. We provided startup capital and mentorship to local Vermont women, over 50 who had a dream but lacked the resources. I sat in my office above the bakery, the same strategic mind that once analyzed stock markets, now analyzing business plans for a chocolatier, a bookstore owner, a landscape gardener. I wasn't just rising from the ashes myself, I was helping create a whole forest of new growth. I became a pillar of my new community, not for my money, but for the wisdom and generosity I could finally share freely. A year after Ethan's visit, I was walking home through the town square. Snow was falling thick, silent flakes that dusted the trees and softened the glow of the streetlights. I had just come from a small charity event sponsored by my foundation, and the laughter of my new friends still echoed in my ears. I paused under a streetlight, pulling my coat tighter, and looked at the vibrant, happy town around me. The warm light spilling from the windows, the sound of a distant church bell, the quiet hum of a community at peace. This was the life I had made, not the one I was born into or married into or given, the one I had built with my own two hands from the rubble of a devastating betrayal. It was my true masterpiece. I was free, I was respected, and I was finally at peace. In the end, Martha Ellison's story teaches a powerful lesson. True liberation isn't found in destroying the past, but in building a new future so compelling that the old one simply fades away. Her revenge wasn't loud or fiery. It was the quiet, steady work of creating a life filled with purpose and genuine joy. She discovered that the ultimate power lies not in forcing others to see your worth, but in building a world where that worth is self-evident, a peaceful kingdom of your own making, where you are finally free.